I never told my daughter's husband who I really was. For 40 years, I hunted the most dangerous fugitives in America as a United States Marshal. But to him and to the rest of the world, I was just Jack Caldwell, a boring, frail state tax accountant living on a fixed pension. He thought I was weak. He thought I was helpless. So when she finally left him, he threatened my life. He promised to destroy me if I did not hand her over. What he did not realize was that by coming to my cabin, he was not walking into an easy victory. He was stepping into a federal staging ground, and we were all waiting for him. It was 11:30 at night, and a brutal thunderstorm was tearing through the Illinois woods. The rain was hitting the metal roof of my cabin like buckshot, while thunder shook the floorboards beneath my feet. I was sitting in my worn armchair by the fireplace, drinking a cup of black coffee and listening to the local radio scan through the static. I am 75 years old, a widower for 5 years since my wife Martha passed away. Martha was the only person on this earth who knew the truth about my career. To everyone else, including my 35-year-old daughter, Emily, I was just a retired numbers guy who spent his days chopping wood and reading history books. It was a quiet life, exactly the kind of life I wanted after decades of pulling my weapon on men who had nothing to lose. I took another sip of coffee when I heard it. A frantic, desperate pounding on the heavy oak of my front door. It was not the polite knock of a neighbor needing a jump start in the rain. It was the rhythm of pure panic. I set my mug down on the wooden side table. The old instincts, the ones I spent 40 years honing in the field, snapped awake instantly. I did not turn on the porch light. I moved silently through the dark living room, keeping my back away from the windows. I reached the door, checked the peephole, and felt a cold knot twist in my stomach. It was Emily. I threw the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open. My daughter stumbled inside, completely soaked to the bone. Her blonde hair was plastered to her face, and she was shivering so violently her teeth were chattering. She had no umbrella. She had no purse. She was wearing only a thin sweater and pajama pants, completely inadequate for a freezing Midwest downpour. I asked her what happened, my voice calm but demanding answers. She could barely speak. She just clung to my shirt, sobbing uncontrollably. She told me she was so sorry she did not know where else to go. She said she just had to get out and run. I closed and locked the door behind her, securing the deadbolt and the heavy metal chain. I led her to the armchair by the fire, grabbed a thick woolen blanket from the cedar chest, and wrapped it tightly around her shoulders. She was a pediatric nurse, normally the strongest, most composed woman I knew. Seeing her broken like this ignited a quiet, dangerous fury deep inside my chest. I told her to sit down and take a breath. I assured her she was safe now and that nobody was coming through that door. I went to the kitchen to pour her a cup of hot tea. When I returned, she was huddled in the chair, staring blankly at the flames. As I reached out to pull the blanket tighter around her left shoulder, her sleeve slid up. I froze. Right there, wrapped around her pale wrist, was a massive, dark purple bruise. It was fresh. The skin was swollen, and the distinct shape of 4 fingers and a thumb was pressed deeply into the tissue. Someone had grabbed her with enough violent force to nearly snap the bone. My vision tunneled. I stared at the bruise, and the quiet tax accountant facade I had maintained for decades began to crack. The federal manhunter, the man who had tracked cartel assassins through the deserts of Mexico, woke up hungry for justice. I asked her who did this to her. My tone dropped. It was no longer the soft, comforting voice of an elderly father. It was the cold, flat voice of an interrogator. Emily looked down at her wrist and panicked. She quickly pulled the sleeve down, shrinking back into the depths of the chair. She begged me not to call the police. She said he would kill us. She told me if she ever told anyone, he would make sure both of us disappeared without a trace. It was Trent, her husband. Trent Lawson. Trent was a 42-year-old vice president of a venture capital firm up in Chicago. He drove a custom luxury car. He wore tailored suits that cost more than my first home. He was slick, arrogant, and treated everyone around him like garbage. I had always despised the man. I knew he was a narcissist. I knew he was manipulative. But physical violence crossed a line from which there is absolutely no return. I knelt in front of her, forcing her to look me in the eyes. I told her to listen to me very carefully. She was in my house under my protection, and Trent was not going to touch her ever again. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face, mixing with the rain. She said I did not understand. I did not know the people he worked with or what he was capable of doing. She said he had money and lawyers. He had told her that if she ran to me, he would crush me. He had called me just an old, fragile man on a fixed income and said he would bankrupt me just for fun. She begged to just hide in the basement for a few days until she could figure out how to disappear completely. I did not argue with her. I did not try to convince her of what I could actually do. Predators like Trent preyed on empathy. They mistook kindness for weakness and old age for helplessness. Trent believed his expensive suits and loud threats granted him power over those who chose to live quietly. He was about to learn a very painful lesson about underestimating the quiet ones. Before I could ask her another question, a sharp, piercing sound cut through the cabin. It was the landline phone in the kitchen. Emily gasped and grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging into my skin. She whispered that it was him, her eyes wide with absolute terror. She begged me not to answer it. I gently detached her hand from my arm. I told her to drink her tea and that I would handle this. I stood up and walked into the darkened kitchen. It kept ringing. The red light flashed in the shadows. The harmless tax accountant was gone. I picked up the receiver and pressed it to my ear. I did not say a word. I just waited. For a few seconds, there was only the sound of heavy rain hitting the roof. Then Trent spoke. His voice was not frantic. It was not the voice of a worried husband. It was cold, dripping with arrogant condescension. He said he knew she was there. I kept my voice completely neutral. I told him it was late and asked what he wanted. He ordered me to send her back by morning. His tone was casual, like he was negotiating a minor business deal over lunch. He claimed she was having a psychotic episode, not thinking clearly, and that she belonged at home with her husband, where she could be treated. I replied that she was not going anywhere. I heard him sigh over the line, a theatrical sound of mock pity. He told me to listen to him, calling me a frail old number cruncher. He reminded me I was living on a state pension in a wooden shack, and said I could not afford the legal hell he was going to rain down on me if I tried to keep his wife from him. He boasted about having lawyers who charged more an hour than I made in a month, saying he would bleed me dry until I had nothing left. Then his voice grew much darker. He said I really could not afford the hospital bills if I happened to slip and fall on my porch. He noted that accidents happened to fragile old men all the time and asked if I understood what he was telling me. I was threatening my life. A slick venture capitalist in a silk tie was threatening to have a United States Marshal assaulted in his own home. If I were a normal father, I would have yelled. I would have sworn at him. I would have called him a monster. But I did not do any of that. Anger is a waste of energy when you are preparing for a hunt. I asked him quietly if he was finished. There was a slight pause on the other end. My lack of fear seemed to confuse his perfectly rehearsed script. He just told me to have her ready by 8 in the morning and warned me not to make him come out there and handle this the hard way. I hung up the phone without another word. I stood in the dark kitchen for a moment, letting the silence wash over me. Trent thought he had all the leverage. He thought he was dealing with a defenseless victim. But true strength does not need to announce itself. It sits patiently in the dark, watching, waiting, and protecting its own. The rest of the night passed in a tense and heavy silence. The brutal thunderstorm that had battered my cabin slowly faded into a steady, freezing drizzle before stopping entirely just before dawn. I did not sleep. I sat in the dark room, with my shotgun resting out of sight, beneath a woven blanket, keeping a close watch over the front window. Emily was exhausted. She had finally fallen asleep on the small cot in the guest room, her body still occasionally twitching from the lingering trauma. I spent those quiet hours preparing my mind. I was no longer an old man waiting for his pension check. I was a hunter waiting for his prey to walk blindly into a trap, right at 8:00 in the morning. The crunch of wet gravel broke the morning stillness. I looked through the faded lace curtains of the front window. A sleek silver Maserati pulled into my muddy driveway. The expensive sports car looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of dripping pine trees and my rusted pickup truck. The engine cut off and the driver's side door opened. Trent stepped out into the crisp morning air. I was wearing a tailored charcoal suit that fit him perfectly, but his performance was already in full swing. He ruffled his normally immaculate hair to make it look unkempt. He slouched his shoulders, adopting the posture of a man completely broken by sorrow. He reached back into the passenger seat and pulled out a large bouquet of white lilies. It was a brilliant piece of acting. If I had been just a simple tax accountant, I might have felt a wave of sympathy for the man. I might have believed that he was truly suffering. But I had spent 40 years sitting across interrogation tables from pathological liars, sociopaths, and killers. I knew how to read the micro-expressions on a man's face. I saw the calculated way his eyes scanned the perimeter of my cabin, searching for security cameras or signs of law enforcement. I saw the rigid tension in his jaw that contradicted the sorrowful droop of his shoulders. He walked up the wooden steps of my porch and knocked softly. It was a gentle, hesitant knock, vastly different from the arrogant tone he had used on the telephone just a few hours earlier. I opened the door and stood in the frame, blocking his view into the house. I wore an oversized flannel shirt and worn-out corduroy slippers, playing the part of the frail, confused father perfectly. Trent looked at me and immediately let out a shaky, theatrical breath. His eyes were red-rimmed as if he had been crying all night. He called my name, his voice cracking with artificial emotion. He told me he was so incredibly sorry to intrude so early in the morning, but he was completely out of his mind with worry. He held up the bouquet of white lilies like a peace offering. He asked if Emily was safe and if she had made it to the cabin in the storm. I stepped aside and gestured for him to come in. I kept my voice weak and slightly tremulous. I told him she was sleeping in the back room and that she had arrived completely terrified. Trent walked into my kitchen and set the lilies on the counter. He pulled out one of the wooden chairs and collapsed into it, burying his face in his hands. He let out a long, trembling sigh. He began to spin a story so perfectly crafted that it almost belonged in a movie. He told me that he did not want to worry me before, but Emily had been deteriorating for months. He claimed she was suffering from severe paranoia and had recently experienced a total psychotic break. I sat across from him, wrapping my hands around a warm mug of coffee, playing the role of the bewildered old man. I asked him what he meant by a psychotic break. Trent leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the wooden table. He looked deeply into my eyes, projecting absolute sincerity. He told me that Emily had stopped taking her medication. He said she was having vivid hallucinations, believing that people were following her and that her own husband was trying to ruin her life. He painted a picture of a woman entirely detached from reality. He said she would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, claiming that the house was bugged and that assassins were waiting outside their windows. He wiped a fake tear from the corner of his eye and told me it had been absolute agony watching the woman he loved lose her mind day by day. I thought about the dark purple bruise shaped like a massive handprint wrapped around my daughter's delicate wrist. I kept my expression perfectly blank. I asked him gently about the marks on her arm. I noted that she looked as though she had been involved in a violent struggle. Trent did not even flinch. His response was smooth and immediate. He let out a choked sob and looked down at his own hands as if they disgusted him. He told me that last night Emily had tried to hurt herself. He claimed she had grabbed a kitchen knife during a violent delusion and was threatening to slash her own wrists. He said he had to use physical force to restrain her, to wrestle the weapon out of her hands and pin her to the floor until she calmed down. He swore to me that he would never intentionally harm a single hair on her head. He said leaving that bruise on her arm was the hardest thing he had ever had to do, but he had to do it to save her life. It was a masterful lie. It explained her terror. It explained her flight in the rain. It explained the physical evidence of abuse. He was expertly shifting the role of the victim from her to him. To back up his story, he reached into the inside pocket of his expensive suit jacket and pulled out a folded stack of papers. He slid them slowly across the kitchen table toward me. He told me he knew it was hard to believe, and that no father ever wants to accept that his child is losing her sanity. He told me to look at the documents. He said they were their joint credit card statements and banking records from the past 3 months. I picked up the papers with trembling hands, ensuring they shook just enough to sell my act. The statements were indeed alarming at first glance. They showed erratic, massive cash withdrawals. $10,000 pulled from an ATM in the middle of the night. $5,000 wired to unknown offshore accounts. Bizarre purchases at random locations. Trent told me Emily had been draining their savings to fund her paranoid delusions, believing she needed cash to escape an imaginary government conspiracy. He claimed she was entirely out of her mind and a danger to herself and everyone around her. I looked at the papers closely. To a retired tax accountant, these numbers would be terrifying proof of mental collapse. But to a former federal investigator, they were something entirely different. They were a breadcrumb trail. I noticed the specific locations of the cash withdrawals and the routing numbers for the wire transfers. But I kept those observations locked safely behind my frail facade. I set the papers down and looked at Trent with wide, fearful eyes. I asked him what we were supposed to do to help her. Trent reached across the table and placed his warm hand over my cold one. His touch made my skin crawl, but I did not pull away. He offered me a reassuring, patronizing smile. He told me not to worry about a single thing. He said he had already made all the necessary arrangements. He informed me that he was going to commit her to a private psychiatric facility today. He claimed it was an exclusive high-end clinic located a few hours north, where she would receive the best intensive care available. Then the mask slipped just a fraction of an inch. His voice dropped, the tone of the grieving husband fading away entirely. He looked at me with cold, calculating eyes and delivered his final instruction. He told me that I was not to interfere under any circumstances. He squeezed my hand slightly, applying just enough pressure to let me know he was in control. He told me that my weak heart simply could not take this kind of stress. He advised me to step aside, let him take his wife and stay completely out of the way. He said it would be a real tragedy if the strain of this situation caused an elderly man like me to have a fatal medical emergency right here in this isolated cabin. I stared back at him, letting my shoulders slump, as if the weight of his words had completely crushed my spirit. I nodded slowly, playing the defeated, broken old man to perfection. I did not yell at him. I did not threaten to call the police. I just sat there and let him believe he had won. But beneath my quiet exterior, the federal manhunter was already calculating the trajectory of Trent's absolute destruction. I knew he was not planning to commit her to a clinic. I was planning to make her disappear. And he had no idea that he had just declared war on a man who had spent a lifetime burying monsters just like him. Trent pushed his chair back from the wooden table. The legs scraped loudly against the floorboards, breaking the heavy silence that had settled over the kitchen. He gave me one last patronizing nod, a look that perfectly communicated his absolute certainty that he had won. He told me he needed to make a few important phone calls to the clinic to finalize the admission paperwork. He pulled his tailored suit jacket tight against the morning chill and stepped out the front door, closing it softly behind him. I walked slowly to the front window. I watched through the faded lace curtains as he crossed the wet gravel driveway and climbed into his sleek silver Maserati. He did not start the engine. He just sat behind the steering wheel, pulling out his phone. He looked entirely relaxed. He probably thought I was sitting in the kitchen, paralyzed by grief and fear. He assumed I was just a helpless old man trying to process the heartbreaking reality of my daughter's mental collapse. He was so incredibly arrogant. Arrogance is a dangerous flaw in any man, but in a predator it is a fatal weakness. It blinds them to the shadows. It makes them sloppy. I turned away from his window and walked back to the kitchen table. The stack of credit card statements and bank records he had left behind sat next to my half-empty coffee mug. I sat down and pulled the papers toward me. To the frightened father dealing with a sudden family crisis, these documents would look absolutely terrifying. They painted a devastating picture of a woman losing her grip on reality, completely destroying her life, and draining her savings in a manic frenzy. But I was not just a father. I had spent 4 decades tracking financial anomalies, hunting down fugitives who tried to hide their dirty money across borders. I had dismantled complex laundering operations for the federal government. I knew what to look for when a paper trail was just a little too perfect. I began to analyze the transactions line by line. The narrative Trent was trying to sell fell apart in less than 2 minutes. The withdrawals were massive and erratic, but they followed a distinct, highly calculated rhythm. There were cash pulls of exactly $9,500, carefully kept just under the federal reporting threshold. A mentally unstable person, having a psychotic break, does not structure their cash withdrawals to avoid raising red flags with the Internal Revenue Service. They do not calculate banking regulations while supposedly fleeing from imaginary assassins, but there was something much more revealing than the amounts. I looked closely at the geographic locations of the transactions. The wire transfers and ATM withdrawals were not scattered randomly. They were heavily concentrated in 3 specific zip codes in Miami, Florida. Emily had never been to Miami. She hated the heat, and she worked 60-hour weeks at the pediatric ward in Chicago. She had no friends there. She had no reason to go there. But I knew exactly what those specific zip codes represented. They were the financial hubs used by shell companies to funnel untraceable cash into offshore accounts in the Caribbean and South America. Trent was not documenting his wife's mental breakdown. He was using her identity to build a smokescreen. He was washing massive amounts of money and leaving a meticulously fabricated paper trail pointing directly at her. If any federal agency ever audited his venture capital firm, they would see a tragic story of a husband trying to save his severely ill wife while she drained his accounts in a manic episode. He was setting her up to take the fall for a massive financial crime. I gathered the papers and placed them neatly back into a single pile. The depth of his manipulation was staggering. He had beaten her, he had terrified her, and now he was framing her to cover his own tracks. I stood up from the table feeling a cold, absolute clarity settling over my mind. The time for playing the passive observer was rapidly coming to an end. I needed to check on Emily. I walked softly down the narrow hallway toward the guest room. The door was slightly ajar. I peered inside and saw my daughter still sleeping soundly on the small cot wrapped tightly in the woolen blanket. Her breathing was steady, but her face was pale and drawn, reflecting the sheer exhaustion of her trauma. I stepped into the room as quietly as I could to retrieve the soaking wet clothes she had discarded on the floor the night before. I picked up her heavy winter coat. It was completely waterlogged, dripping cold rain onto the hardwood planks. I carried it out to the mudroom by the back door, intending to hang it over the old radiator to dry. As I draped the heavy fabric over the cast iron slats, I felt something strange. There was a hard, unnatural lump concealed deep within the lining of the right pocket. I paused. The lump was roughly the size of a large coin, thick and perfectly smooth. I ran my thumb over the fabric, feeling the distinct rigid edges of a plastic casing. My pulse remained steady, but my mind began to race. I knew exactly what I was feeling. I went to the workbench in the corner of the mudroom and picked up a small utility knife. With surgical precision, I made a tiny incision in the inner seam of the pocket lining. I slipped 2 fingers into the gap and pulled the object out into the light. It was a micro GPS tracking device. It was a sophisticated piece of hardware, equipped with a long-lasting lithium battery and a magnetic backing. It was not something you could simply buy off a shelf at a local hardware store. It was military-grade tracking equipment, designed to transmit a constant encrypted signal. I stared at the small black device resting in the palm of my hand. The implications hit me with the force of a physical blow. Trent had not miraculously guessed that Emily would run to my isolated cabin in the middle of a brutal thunderstorm. He had not frantically called my phone out of a sudden stroke of intuition. I knew exactly where she was, because he had been tracking her every single movement. He was treating my daughter like an asset, to be monitored, a piece of property he controlled with absolute precision. He had placed this device on her long before she ever decided to run. He had been suffocating her, anticipating her escape, and ensuring she could never truly hide from him. I crushed the tracker under my boot. The game was over. I picked up the shattered pieces of plastic and circuit boards. Trent believed he held all the power because he assumed I was blind. But my eyes were wide open. The helpless father facade had served its purpose perfectly. It was finally time to step out of the shadows and completely level the playing field. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the encrypted phone I had, intended to use, only to realize its battery had long since died. It did not matter. The time for relying on improvised tools and quiet observation was officially over. I dropped the dead device onto the workbench right next to the crushed remains of Trent's tracking bug. I turned my back on the mudroom and walked deliberately through the silent cabin. My posture shifted with every step I took. The stooped shoulders of the grieving father vanished. The slow, shuffling gait of the retired tax accountant disappeared completely. I stood tall, and my breathing steadied into a calm, measured rhythm. I was stepping back into a skin I had not worn since the day I retired, but it fit me perfectly. I walked down the narrow hallway and stopped in front of a heavy solid wood door at the very end. I unlocked the deadbolt and opened it, revealing the steep wooden staircase leading down into the darkness of the basement. I flipped the light switch, and a single bare bulb flickered to life, casting long, deep shadows across the concrete walls. I descended the stairs with purposeful, silent steps. The basement looked exactly like what anyone would expect to find beneath the home of an elderly widower. It was cluttered with dusty cardboard boxes, stacks of old financial newspapers, rusted gardening tools, and faded plastic decorations. It was the perfect visual deterrent for any curious houseguest. I walked past the moving boxes that held Martha's old clothes and stopped in the far back corner of the room. A massive, heavy wooden shelving unit stood against the concrete foundation wall, packed tightly with cans of dried paint and jars of assorted screws. To anyone else, it was simply a permanent fixture of the room. I reached under the bottom shelf and pressed a concealed metal latch. The locking mechanism disengaged with a dull, heavy click. I grabbed the edge of the shelving unit and pulled it firmly toward me. The entire structure swung forward smoothly on hidden industrial hinges, revealing a recessed alcove carved directly into the foundation. The false wall panel had hidden my past for over 5 years. I stared into the dark alcove at the heavy steel door of a biometric safe bolted deeply into the reinforced concrete. It was a military-grade vault designed to withstand intense heat and explosive breaches. I had not touched the biometric scanner since the day I formally handed in my retirement papers. I placed my right thumb against the glass reader. A small red light blinked once, then turned a solid bright green. 3 heavy steel locking bolts retracted with a loud, satisfying clank. I gripped the thick handle and pulled the heavy door open. The sharp metallic scent of gun oil and brass drifted out, mingling with the damp smell of the basement. Inside the safe, resting on dark foam padding, was my old duty weapon. It was a customized Sig Sauer P226, chambered in 9mm. The blued steel finish was slightly worn around the edges, from years of being drawn and holstered, but the weapon was immaculately maintained. I reached in and wrapped my fingers around the textured grip. The familiar weight of the pistol in my hand felt grounding, like reuniting with an old trusted friend who had saved my life more times than I could count. I picked up a fully loaded magazine and slid it firmly into the grip until it locked into place with a sharp metallic snap. I pulled the slide back, chambering the first round, and carefully engaged the safety. I tucked the heavy pistol into the waistband of my trousers. Next to the weapon sat a thick black Pelican case. I unlatched the heavy plastic clips and opened the lid. Resting securely inside the protective foam was a military encrypted satellite phone. It was completely untraceable, routing its signal through a series of secure proxy servers that bypassed all local cellular towers. I pulled the phone out and powered it on. The small digital screen illuminated, casting a pale blue glow across the dark basement. I waited patiently as the device established a secure, encrypted uplink. I did not need to look up any phone numbers. There was only one man I trusted enough to call in a situation like this. I punched in a highly secure 12-digit sequence and pressed the call button. I held the heavy device to my ear and listened to the hollow electronic tone of the secure connection routing across the country. I was calling Tom Barrett. Tom and I had spent 2 decades working together on some of the most dangerous fugitive task forces in the entire country. When I finally retired to a quiet life, Tom took a completely different path. He transitioned into the private sector, working as an off-the-grid cyber intelligence contractor. He was a ghost in the digital world, capable of pulling financial records and encrypted communications out of thin air. I was 72 years old, but his mind was sharper than a razor. The line connected with a sharp beep, and a gruff voice answered on the first ring. Tom did not offer any warm greetings. He simply stated my name, recognizing the secure signal. I bypassed the standard pleasantries. I did not ask how he was doing, and I did not ask for advice. I needed a hunter. I told him that I had a specific target named Trent Lawson. I explained that Trent was a vice president at a high-profile venture capital firm operating out of Chicago. Tom remained completely silent on the line, already typing rapidly on a mechanical keyboard in the background. I told him I needed a deep-dive background check on everything Trent touched. I was not looking for his polished corporate portfolio or his public tax returns. I needed the dirty money trail. I told Tom to look for offshore shell companies, hidden assets, and sudden influxes of untraceable capital. I explained that Trent had just placed a sophisticated military-grade tracker on my daughter and was structuring localized cash withdrawals to mirror a psychotic break. The rapid clacking of Tom's keyboard suddenly stopped. He knew exactly what those specific financial maneuvers meant. He told me those were advanced laundering tactics, usually reserved for high-level syndicate players. I confirmed his suspicion and told him Trent had threatened my life and was actively maneuvering to make Emily disappear. I told Tom I needed absolute proof of where the dirty money was flowing and exactly who Trent was working for. I needed the financial leverage to crush him completely. Tom did not hesitate for a single second. He told me he would tear Trent's digital life apart piece by piece and call me back the moment he found the core of the operation. He hung up, leaving me in the silence of the basement. I stared at the locked safe, feeling the cold, heavy steel of the pistol against my hip. Trent thought he was hunting a terrified runaway wife and her helpless, aging father. But he had just stepped onto a battlefield he could not possibly comprehend. I powered down the phone and returned it to the case, securing the latches. From a small compartment in the back of the safe, I retrieved exactly what I needed for the next phase of my plan. It was a military-grade audio and global transmitter. The device was the size of a matchbox, encased in black rubber, with a powerful magnetic backing designed to latch onto a vehicle undercarriage and stay there through any terrain. I slipped the bug into the pocket of my flannel shirt, letting its weight reassure me. I closed the vault door, listening to the steel bolts lock back into place before sliding the heavy wooden shelving unit back into its original position, hiding my past once more. I walked up the wooden stairs, closing the door behind me and taking a breath to re-enter my character. The federal manhunter was fully awake, but the fragile tax accountant was the mask I needed to wear. I walked into the kitchen and moved with intentional slowness, dragging my feet across the linoleum floor. I needed to look utterly broken. I poured water into the coffee maker and switched the machine on. As the liquid began to brew, I practiced my posture in the reflection of the microwave door. I slumped my shoulders forward, allowing my chest to cave in slightly. I relaxed the muscles in my face, making my eyes look tired and defeated. I let my hands tremble, simulating the anxious tremors of an elderly man who realized he was entirely outmatched by a wealthier opponent. Trent expected me to surrender. He expected his threats to terrify me into absolute compliance. Giving him exactly what he wanted was the fastest way to lower his guard completely. I took a ceramic mug and filled it to the brim with black coffee. I did not add sugar or cream. It was a peace offering meant to stroke his massive ego. I picked up my house keys from the kitchen island, clutching them tightly in my left hand, while holding the hot mug in my right. I opened the front door, stepping out onto the wet planks of the porch. The thunderstorm had passed, leaving behind a cold mist that clung to the trees. The gravel driveway was slick with mud and deep puddles. Trent was still sitting comfortably inside his sleek silver Maserati, the engine off, and the windows rolled up. He was staring at his phone, clearly completely oblivious to his surroundings. To a predator, the world is only dangerous when they are looking directly at a threat. They never look at the prey they believe they have already conquered. I walked down the porch steps, moving with a slow, painful shuffle. I let my knees buckle slightly with each step, ensuring he saw me struggling against the cold, damp air. I navigated the muddy puddles with exaggerated difficulty, projecting the image of a defeated man. As I approached the window, Trent looked up from his glowing screen. I saw a smirk cross his face before he quickly hid it behind his mask of artificial sorrow. He pressed a button, and the tinted glass window rolled down silently, letting the crisp morning air into the luxurious leather interior of his vehicle. He looked at me with cold, condescending eyes, waiting for me to speak. I stood by the door of his car, letting my hand shake slightly as I held out the steaming mug of coffee toward him. I kept my voice weak and hollow, barely above a whisper. I told him he had won. I said I was too old and too tired to fight him, and that I could not protect her if she truly needed professional psychiatric help. I told him I did not want any trouble with his lawyers or any problems with the hospital bills he had warned me about. I looked down at the muddy ground, acting completely ashamed of my own surrender. I told him to take the coffee and come inside the cabin so I could help him pack her things. Trent took the ceramic mug from my trembling hand, his fingers brushing against mine. His grip was firm and arrogant. He looked down at me like I was a pathetic, wounded animal putting itself out of its misery. He told me I was making the smartest decision of my life. He said it was a tragedy, that it had to come to this, but that he appreciated me finally seeing reason and stepping aside like a sensible man. He took a sip of the black coffee and nodded in approval. He pushed the heavy car door open, forcing me to take a clumsy step backward to avoid being hit. He stepped out onto the wet gravel, smoothing his expensive charcoal suit jacket and adjusting his collar. He towered over me, projecting absolute dominance. He did not say thank you. He simply told me to lead the way and make sure she did not try to put up a fight. I turned around slowly, beginning my slow, shuffled walk back toward the wooden porch. Trent followed a few paces behind me, sipping his coffee and carrying his arrogant victory like a banner. As we reached the rear bumper of his Maserati, I executed the maneuver I had planned. I loosened my grip on the metal keyring in my left hand, letting the keys slip through my fingers. They hit the wet gravel with a sharp metallic clatter, landing perfectly near the rear tire. I let out a frustrated, theatrical sigh and muttered a complaint about my terrible arthritis. I stopped walking and slowly lowered myself toward the ground, letting my knees crack and groan. Trent stopped right behind me, completely unconcerned. He did not offer to help me pick them up. He just stood there watching the pathetic old man struggle in the mud. I reached the ground with my left hand, grabbing the wet keys from the gravel. Simultaneously, my right hand slipped silently into the deep pocket of my flannel shirt. I palmed the military-grade tracking bug, feeling the magnet on its flat side. While my body blocked his line of sight, I reached my right arm deeply underneath the rear bumper of his luxury vehicle. I found a flat structural metal beam near the exhaust housing and pressed the device firmly against the steel. The heavy magnet seized the metal, instantly locking into place with total security. The bug was now completely invisible from the outside, completely shielded from the elements, and securely broadcasting a steady, encrypted signal. I pushed myself back up to a standing position, letting out a pained groan and brushing the wet mud from my knees. I pocketed my keys and gave Trent a defeated nod. He smirked slightly and gestured toward the cabin door, completely unaware that his sleek, expensive vehicle was now a rolling federal wiretap. He walked past me up the wooden steps and into my home while I stood in the wet gravel, feeling a dangerous smile form in my mind. I had just successfully wired the dangerous predator. The real hunt had now officially begun. I walked back into the cabin, pulling the heavy wooden door shut behind me. The silence inside was thick and suffocating. I moved quietly down the narrow hallway and found Trent standing right outside the guest bathroom. His posture was rigid, but the moment he heard my footsteps, he instantly relaxed his shoulders, slipping seamlessly back into his carefully crafted role. He leaned against the wall and let out a long, exasperated sigh. He looked at me with an expression of manufactured pity. I explained that Emily had bolted from the bedroom and locked herself inside the small bathroom the second she heard him enter the house. He said she was completely unresponsive to his voice and was likely suffering a severe panic attack triggered by her paranoid delusions. He knocked softly on the sturdy oak door, pressing his forehead against the wood. He spoke to her in a soothing, sickeningly sweet tone, telling her that he loved her and that he only wanted to get her the medical help she desperately needed. There was absolutely no response from the other side of the door. Not a single sound. Trent turned to me and shook his head, portraying the exhausted, devoted husband. He said it was useless to try and force her out right now. He claimed that breaking the door down would only escalate her psychotic break and potentially cause her to harm herself. He told me he would leave and give her a few hours to calm down. He promised to return later in the evening with a private ambulance and trained psychiatric personnel to handle the extraction professionally. He gave my shoulder a patronizing squeeze and told me to just keep her contained until he got back. I nodded silently, playing the overwhelmed father one last time. I followed him to the front door and watched as he stepped out onto the porch. He walked down the steps, crossed the wet, muddy gravel, and slid into the luxurious leather driver's seat of his silver Maserati. The powerful engine roared to life, shattering the quiet morning air. I stood at the window and watched the vehicle reverse out of the driveway, tires kicking up wet dirt as it accelerated down the winding rural road. I waited exactly 30 seconds until the taillights disappeared completely behind the dense line of pine trees. The moment the heavy silence returned to the woods, the heavy black satellite phone hidden deep in my flannel pocket began to vibrate with a sharp, aggressive rhythm. I pulled the device out and pressed it to my ear. I did not need to say hello. Tom Barrett spoke immediately, and his voice was completely devoid of its usual gruff warmth. His tone was dead serious, carrying the distinct, grim weight of a man who had just uncovered a massive, deadly operation. Tom told me he had ripped through the corporate firewalls of Trent's venture capital firm. He bypassed the dummy corporations and followed the encrypted wire transfers all the way down to the bedrock. He said Trent was not just moving money for minor players. His firm was functioning as a primary washing machine for the Valenzuela syndicate. The cartel was using his legitimate business front to clean tens of millions of dollars in illicit narcotics revenue. But that was not the reason Tom sounded so incredibly tense. He took a heavy breath and told me there was something much worse. Tom had cross-referenced Trent's personal financial profiles and finally uncovered a newly established, deeply buried secret portfolio. Exactly 3 weeks ago, Trent had taken out a massive, comprehensive life insurance policy on Emily. The payout was $10 million. It included specific clauses that guaranteed a full payout in the event of accidental death or suicide. The air in my lungs turned to ice. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together, forming a horrifyingly clear picture. Trent was not trying to commit my daughter to a high-end private psychiatric facility. He had no intention of getting her medical help. He was actively laying the groundwork to murder her. The staged credit card withdrawals, the erratic cash pulls, the meticulous narrative of a sudden, violent, psychotic break. It was all designed to build a flawless alibi. He needed a documented history of severe mental instability. He needed a paper trail proving that his wife had lost her mind, so that when she inevitably suffered a tragic, fatal accident or a sudden, devastating suicide, no one would ever question it. The local police would take one look at her financial records, hear the grieving husband's testimony, and close the case in 48 hours. He would walk away with $10 million clean dollars, perfectly washed and legally acquired through the insurance payout. I thanked Tom, dropping my voice to a dangerous whisper. I told him to keep monitoring the wiretap on the Maserati and hung up the phone. I walked straight to the guest bathroom and knocked firmly on the wood. I told Emily it was her father and that the predator was gone. The lock clicked and the door slowly opened. Emily stood there, pale and trembling, her eyes wide with lingering terror. I did not offer her comforting platitudes. I looked her directly in the eyes and spoke with absolute authority. I told her we were leaving this cabin right now. I grabbed her heavy winter coat from the dark mudroom, wrapping it tightly around her shivering shoulders. I moved swiftly through the house, pulling a heavy canvas duffel bag from the hall closet. I packed it with medical supplies, thermal blankets, non-perishable rations, and a large box of 9mm ammunition. I shoved my old badge and extra magazines into the side pockets. I led her out the back door, completely avoiding the front driveway. We moved quickly through the wet grass and piled into my rusted heavy-duty pickup truck parked behind the woodshed. The engine sputtered slightly before roaring to a steady, powerful hum. I threw the gear shift into reverse and navigated through the muddy back trails, entirely avoiding the main highway, where Trent or his associates might have left spotters. I drove her deep into the dense, unforgiving terrain of the nearby mountains. We traveled for 2 agonizing hours, climbing steep, rocky switchbacks and crossing narrow wooden bridges that groaned under the weight of the truck. I was taking her to a highly secure federal safe house I knew from my active duty days. It was an off-the-grid, reinforced concrete structure, hidden entirely beneath a dense canopy of ancient cedar trees. It had no registered address, no digital footprint, and thick steel-reinforced doors. When we finally arrived, I pulled the truck into the concealed garage and shut off the engine. The silence of the isolated mountain was profound. I ushered Emily inside, locking the heavy steel deadbolts behind us. The safe house was cold and dark, but it was a fortress. I turned on the backup generator, bathing the room in dim yellow light. I handed Emily a warm blanket and told her to rest on the cot. I was preparing for a brutal war. I knew keeping Emily at the safe house was the only way to guarantee her safety, but I could not stay there. If Trent sent his men, they would target my property first. I needed to be the bait and draw them into an environment I controlled completely. I explained the lockdown procedures to my daughter, making sure she understood not to open the heavy steel door for anyone but me or Tom. She nodded, pulling the blanket tightly around her shoulders. Her eyes were wide with fear, but she trusted me. I promised her the nightmare would be over soon and stepped back out into the freezing mountain air, locking the vault door behind me. I climbed back into my rusted pickup truck and navigated the treacherous, rocky switchbacks, making my way down the mountain toward the rural valley. The drive gave me time to focus my mind. I was no longer a helpless accountant. I was a United States Marshal returning to the battlefield. I pulled into my driveway an hour later. The rain had completely stopped, leaving the woods draped in a thick fog that swallowed the surrounding trees. The cabin was exactly as I had left it, completely dark and completely silent. I parked my truck out of sight behind the woodshed and walked through the damp grass, entering through the back mudroom. I did not turn on any lights. I navigated the familiar layout of my home by memory, moving silently through the shadows. I walked into the living room and sat down heavily in my worn armchair by the cold fireplace. I reached into the side pocket of my canvas duffel bag and pulled out the encrypted satellite phone and a pair of tactical noise-canceling headphones. I plugged the heavy audio jack into the base of the phone and slipped the padded cups over my ears. The world outside the cabin vanished instantly, replaced by the low hum of electronic static transmitting from the military-grade bug I had attached to the undercarriage of Trent's silver Maserati. I closed my eyes and focused entirely on the audio feed. For the first few minutes, there was nothing but the muffled rhythmic thumping of the car's suspension and the low, powerful hum of the expensive engine. Trent was driving fast, pushing the luxury vehicle hard over the wet asphalt. Then the heavy silence in the cabin of his car was broken by the sharp trill of an incoming cellular call connecting through his dashboard audio system. I heard a loud beep as he answered the call. I braced myself, expecting to hear the smooth, arrogant tone he had used with me just hours before. But the voice that echoed through my headphones was completely unrecognizable. Trent was not slick, and he was not in control. He was breathing heavily, his voice tight and trembling with pure panic. He started frantically screaming at the person on the other end of the line. He called the man on the phone by a Spanish name, begging him to listen and pleading for just a little more time to make things right. The man on the other end did not raise his voice. He spoke in a low, calm, and absolutely terrifying tone with a thick accent. He told Trent that the organization did not grant extensions, and that patience was a luxury reserved for people who did not steal from the Valenzuela syndicate. Trent sounded like he was on the verge of hyperventilating. He swore aggressively, swearing up and down that he had not stolen the money. He tried to explain that it was a temporary liquidity issue caused by a sudden collapse in the digital markets. He confessed in a rush of terrified words that he had diverted $5 million of the syndicate's cleaning funds into an experimental offshore cryptocurrency investment, hoping to double the yield before the quarterly audit. He said the market had unexpectedly crashed overnight, and the digital asset firm had frozen all withdrawals. The $5 million was completely gone, evaporated into the digital ether. The cartel liaison on the phone remained completely unmoved by the frantic explanation. He told Trent that the syndicate did not care about market fluctuations or digital assets. He stated simply that $5 million was missing from the ledger, and that blood was the only acceptable currency for theft. He told Trent that the leadership down south had already authorized a collection team to visit his high-rise office in Chicago. Trent began to openly sob over the steering wheel. The sound was pathetic and hollow, stripped of all the refined arrogance he paraded around in public. He begged the liaison to call the team off, offering anything he could think of to buy his life. He said he had a guaranteed payout, coming a massive influx of perfectly clean, untraceable cash that would cover the missing $5 million and provide an extra $2 million as a penalty fee for the inconvenience. He pleaded for just 72 hours to finalize the transaction. The liaison paused, seemingly intrigued by the promise of a $2 million penalty payment. He asked Trent where exactly a venture capitalist operating in the red was going to suddenly manifest $7 million in untraceable cash within 3 days. I gripped the armrests of my chair, my knuckles turning white in the darkness of my empty cabin. I knew exactly what Trent was going to say, but hearing the words spoken aloud chilled me to the bone. Trent swallowed hard, his voice dropping into a desperate, chilling whisper. He told the cartel liaison that he was handling it personally. He said his crazy wife was currently staying at her elderly father's isolated cabin out in the rural woods. He explained that she had a documented history of severe mental instability and paranoid delusions. Then he delivered the final piece of his monstrous plan. He told the man that his wife was about to have a very tragic and completely unavoidable fatal accident at that cabin. He said the paperwork for a $10 million comprehensive life insurance policy was already active and fully binding. He assured the liaison that because of her fabricated medical history and the isolated location, no local police department would ever look at her death as anything other than a heartbreaking suicide or a terrible mishap. He promised that the insurance company was contractually obligated to pay out the $10 million within 48 hours of the official coroner report. The cartel liaison agreed, giving Trent exactly 72 hours to deliver $7 million to an offshore account. He warned that failure meant a slow, agonizing death. The line went dead with a sharp click. Trent let out a ragged, horrifying scream, hitting his steering wheel in pure, terrified panic. He was completely trapped with no way out. He was planning to murder my daughter to save his own miserable life tonight. I reached down and touched the cold steel of the pistol tucked into my waistband. He had absolutely no idea what was waiting for him. The audio feed from the tracker underneath the silver Maserati continued to broadcast a crystal-clear signal directly into my headphones. I listened intently as the sounds of the heavy rain faded entirely, replaced by the rhythmic hum of the vehicle speeding down the interstate. Trent was breathing in ragged, shallow gasps, trying to regain his composure after his terrifying conversation with the cartel liaison. He needed to execute his murderous plan immediately. I heard the sharp click of the turn signal. The ambient noise shifted from the open highway to the echoing concrete acoustics of a subterranean parking garage. The heavy tires screeched slightly as he navigated the tight spiral ramps descending deeper underground. He finally brought the luxury car to a halt, shutting off the powerful engine. The heavy silence of the empty garage pressed through the audio feed. He was waiting for someone. I sat perfectly still in my dark cabin, my hands resting lightly on the armrests of my chair. I knew exactly what was about to happen. A man backed into a corner with a 72-hour death sentence hanging over his head does not hesitate. He outsources the violence. A few minutes passed before the distinct heavy thud of approaching footsteps echoed across the concrete. There were two distinct sets of boots moving with the casual, confident swagger of professional enforcers. I heard the heavy clunk of the passenger side door opening, followed immediately by the back door. The suspension of the sports car groaned slightly as two large men climbed into the plush leather interior. The doors slammed shut, sealing the three men inside the soundproof cabin. Trent did not offer any formal greetings. His voice had returned to that cold, arrogant tone he used to mask his absolute terror. He tossed something heavy onto the center console. The unmistakable dull thud of a thick envelope packed with solid cash hitting the leather armrest. He told the men there was $50,000 inside that envelope right now, and another $50,000 waiting for them by tomorrow morning, if the job was executed flawlessly tonight. One of the men let out a low, raspy chuckle, accompanied by the rustling sound of paper as he thumbed through the crisp bills. He asked Trent what exactly they were burning down for $100,000. Trent did not hesitate. His voice was completely devoid of any human empathy. He gave them the exact address of my rural cabin out in the woods. He told them his wife was currently staying there with her elderly father. He outlined the operation with chilling precision. He ordered them to drive out to the property tonight, wait until well past midnight, and then quietly douse the perimeter of the wooden structure with a highly flammable chemical accelerant. He explicitly instructed them to block the front and rear exits before striking the match. He told them to burn the entire cabin to the bare ground, with both of us trapped inside. The second enforcer spoke up, his voice a deep, rumbling baritone. He asked if the old man was going to be a problem. I wanted to know if they needed to anticipate any armed resistance or complex security systems protecting the property. Trent let out a sharp, dismissive laugh that made my blood run absolutely cold. He told the enforcers they had absolutely nothing to worry about regarding the father. He painted a pathetic picture of the man he believed me to be. He confidently assured the two hitmen that I was just a frail, harmless state tax accountant living on a miserable fixed pension. He said my heart was so incredibly weak that I would probably drop dead from pure fright the second I smelled the smoke. He explicitly told them the old tax guy would not even put up a fight. He said I did not own any weapons and had zero tactical training. He ordered them to make the entire scene look like a tragic accidental gas leak. I explained that a faulty propane heater mixed with an old wooden structure would completely satisfy the local fire investigators. He stressed that the insurance company would send their own adjusters so there could not be a single bullet casing or forced entry mark left behind. The fire had to consume all the evidence. The men agreed to the terms. They told Trent to keep his phone on and wait for the confirmation call before sunrise. The car doors opened and slammed shut again, leaving Trent alone in the quiet vehicle. I heard him let out a long, trembling breath, finally allowing his fear to surface once the hired muscle had departed. He started the engine, the roar echoing loudly off the concrete walls, and sped out of the underground garage to establish his alibi. I slowly reached up and pulled the padded headphones off my ears, setting them gently on the small wooden table next to my chair. The quiet ambient sounds of the dark cabin rushed back in replacing the electronic static of the wiretap. I sat in the total darkness, processing the absolute brutality of what I had just listened to. My own son-in-law had just paid $100,000 to have my daughter and me burned alive in our sleep. He wanted a gas leak. He wanted a tragic accident. I stood up from the armchair, my body moving with fluid mechanical precision. The situation had escalated past any possibility of a peaceful resolution. I could not simply call the local police department and report a murder conspiracy. Trent had already heavily implied that he had the local authorities situated firmly inside his expensive pockets. Any squad car dispatched to my property would either tip off the hitmen or, worse, actively participate in the cover-up. I was completely on my own. But being on my own was never a disadvantage for a federal manhunter. It was exactly where I operated best. I walked purposefully toward the heavy oak table in the center of the room. I reached down to my waistband and drew the Sig Sauer 9mm pistol, setting it down on the smooth wood. Then I walked over to the tall, locked gun cabinet, hidden securely behind the pantry door. I retrieved my modified 12-gauge pump-action shotgun. It was a heavy, devastating weapon designed for close quarters, combat, and absolute stopping power. I carried it back to the table and began loading the magazine tube with heavy buckshot shells. The solid metallic clack of each shell sliding firmly into the chamber echoed loudly through the empty cabin. I racked the slide back with a sharp, aggressive motion, chambering the first lethal round. I turned off the remaining ambient lights, plunging the entire cabin into pitch-black darkness. I pulled a sturdy wooden chair up to the front window and sat down, the heavy shotgun resting comfortably across my lap. Trent truly believed he had just hired two vicious wolves to easily slaughter a weak and completely helpless sheep. He was fundamentally dead wrong about me. Let them come to the helpless tax accountant. I sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the steady rhythm of my own breathing. The heavy shotgun across my lap was a comforting weight, a physical promise that my daughter would remain untouched. But physical violence was only one small part of the equation. Trent believed he could solve his problems with $100,000 in cash and a gallon of chemical accelerant. He thought he was playing a localized game of intimidation and brute force. I was about to show him the crushing bureaucratic weight of the federal government. I was not just going to sit here and shoot two hired thugs when they inevitably kicked in my front door. Killing the foot soldiers would only delay the inevitable confrontation. I needed to cut the head completely off the snake. I needed to destroy his entire financial empire before he even pulled into my driveway. I carefully laid the shotgun across the wooden table, making sure the safety was still fully engaged. I walked back to my worn armchair and picked up the heavy black satellite phone. The digital screen cast a pale blue glow across my weathered hands. I dialed Tom's secure number once again. He answered immediately, not bothering with any pleasantries or standard greetings. He knew that if I was calling back this quickly, the situation had escalated far beyond a simple extraction protocol. I told Tom that Trent had just hired a hit squad to burn my cabin to the ground, with Emily and me trapped inside. I explained that the cartel had given him a 72-hour window to replace $5 million missing dollars, and that Trent was planning to use a fraudulent life insurance payout to cover his massive outstanding debt. Tom did not sound surprised by the sheer brutality of the plan. He simply asked what my operational parameters were moving forward. I told him we were taking off the gloves entirely and leaving absolutely nothing behind. I gave him a specific 10-digit alphanumeric sequence. It was my old federal clearance code, the master override key, I had retained upon my quiet retirement. I told him we were going to initiate a Title III wiretap protocol and force a massive immediate red flag across the entire global banking system. Tom let out a low whistle of appreciation over the secure line. He warned me that using those specific clearance codes would permanently burn my civilian cover and alert the highest levels of the Justice Department to my active status. I told him I did not care about my cover anymore. My daughter was in imminent danger, and her husband was a dead man walking. I ordered Tom to execute the protocol and dismantle the venture capital firm piece by piece. I listened to the furious clacking of a mechanical keyboard transmitting through the encrypted line. Tom was a digital maestro weaving through corporate firewalls and international banking servers with terrifying, unparalleled speed. He narrated his actions as he breached the primary defense layers of Trent's heavily guarded financial network. He explained that Trent had built a sophisticated web of dummy corporations operating out of Delaware and Nevada. These shadow shell companies were designed to intake massive amounts of dirty cartel cash, disguise the funds as legitimate venture capital investments, and filter the clean money into offshore accounts located primarily in the Cayman Islands. It was an elegant laundering machine perfectly structured to avoid standard government audits. But it was completely defenseless against a targeted federal override. Tom bypassed the secondary authentication servers, using my clearance codes to authorize a shadow sweep of the entire hidden network. He found the master ledger hidden securely behind 3 complex layers of biometric encryption. He told me he was currently looking at the exact routing numbers Trent planned to use for the hit money and the anticipated insurance payout. I told him to burn it all down to the bare foundation. Tom initiated the Cascade Protocol without another word. He took the master ledger and forcibly forwarded the unencrypted data directly to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Within seconds, algorithms deep inside the Federal Treasury Department began to scream. The sudden influx of raw, undeniable evidence of international money laundering triggered an automatic and irreversible lockdown sequence. I sat in my dark cabin listening to Tom confirm the systematic execution of Trent's financial empire. He told me the domestic accounts were the first to fall under the immense pressure. Every single corporate account linked to the venture capital firm was immediately frozen by federal regulators. The account balances were permanently locked, the assets seized, pending a massive criminal investigation. Trent's personal checking accounts, his luxury credit lines and his private investment portfolios were completely zeroed out in a matter of heartbeats. He was suddenly unable to buy a cup of coffee, let alone finance an international escape. But we did not stop at the domestic borders. Tom used the compromised routing data to send poison pill requests to the offshore banking institutions. The international banks, terrified of severe federal sanctions and catastrophic penalties, immediately complied, shutting down the hidden accounts. Within exactly 20 minutes, the entire operation was finalized. Tom stopped typing and let out a long, heavy sigh over the line. He confirmed that every single one of Trent's domestic and offshore accounts was now frozen solid, under suspicion of severe money laundering and cartel collusion. He told me Trent was officially a financial ghost. He possessed absolutely no liquid assets, no lines of credit, and no viable way to access the syndicate's remaining hidden funds. The massive fortune he had built through lies and intimidation was entirely gone, swallowed by the very system he thought he had completely mastered. He was trapped in a luxury car that was effectively a steel cage with zero means of escape. I felt a cold, absolute sense of satisfaction wash over me in the dark room. Trent had spent his entire life using money as a weapon to manipulate, intimidate, and mercilessly abuse the people around him. He had wielded his wealth like a heavy club, believing it made him completely untouchable and entirely above the law. He had terrorized my daughter, believing she had no resources to fight back. Now his greatest weapon had been entirely stripped away. He was financially decapitated, stripped of all his power and influence. I thanked Tom for his immaculate work and told him to maintain his digital overwatch throughout the rest of the long night. I disconnected the call and placed the phone back on the small wooden table, taking a very slow, deliberate breath. I picked up my 12-gauge shotgun, feeling the cold, rigid steel against my palms. Trent was still out there, driving around in a luxury vehicle he could no longer afford, making deadly plans with money he no longer possessed. He was completely unaware that he had already lost the war and that I was simply waiting to deliver the final devastating blow. The helpless accountant was completely gone. I racked the slide back one more time, the mechanical sound echoing loudly, promising absolute justice for my beloved daughter. The heavy metallic click of the shotgun slide echoed through the silent cabin, hanging in the damp air like a final judgment. I rested the weapon back onto my lap, keeping my finger hovering just outside the trigger guard. Freezing Trent's bank accounts was a devastating tactical maneuver, but it was still fundamentally a defensive action. It stripped him of his resources, but it did not permanently neutralize the threat he posed. A desperate man with a ruined empire is unpredictable, and an unpredictable predator is the most dangerous kind. I needed to ensure that Trent was so completely consumed by his own survival that he would never have the opportunity to focus his attention on Emily ever again. I needed to introduce an external force of nature that would hunt him relentlessly across the globe. I picked up the heavy black satellite phone from the wooden side table and dialed Tom's secure number for the third time tonight. He answered immediately, the sound of his mechanical keyboard already clacking rapidly in the background. I told him we were moving to the final phase of the financial ambush. I needed the specific ledgers he had hacked from Trent's hidden offshore network. I did not want the entire data dump, just the specific files detailing exactly where the missing $5 million had actually gone. Tom let out a low, appreciative hum over the encrypted line. He told me he was already looking at the exact documents. Trent had lied to the cartel liaison during his panicked phone call. He claimed he had lost the syndicate money in a sudden, catastrophic cryptocurrency market crash. But the digital ledgers told a completely different and far more arrogant story. Tom explained that Trent had systematically skimmed the $5 million over a period of 6 months, funneling the cash through 3 layers of dummy corporations based in the Bahamas. He had not invested the money in digital assets. He had used the cartel funds to quietly purchase a massive luxury yacht registered under a holding company completely controlled by his own name. He had stolen directly from one of the most violent and unforgiving syndicates on the planet to fund his personal vanity. I told Tom to package those specific transaction histories, the yacht registration documents, and the routing numbers into a single highly compressed data file. I instructed him to strip the file of all digital fingerprints, leaving absolutely no trace of federal involvement or our IP addresses. We needed this to look like an internal leak from a disgruntled employee or a rival faction. Tom worked in total silence for 3 minutes, applying layers of ghost encryption to mask our origin point. He asked me where I wanted the package delivered. I gave him the primary administrative email address for the Shell Corporation, the Valenzuela syndicate used for their international logistics. It was an address I had memorized during a joint task force operation a decade ago. I told Tom to send this message with a high-priority tag and immediately scrub the connection. He executed the command, sending the undeniable proof of Trent's massive theft directly into the hands of the cartel leadership. I thanked Tom one final time and ended the call, setting the phone down. I picked up the tactical headphones and slipped them back over my ears, immersing myself once more into the audio feed, transmitting from the undercarriage of the silver Maserati. Trent was still sitting inside his parked car, the heavy rain pattering against the windshield. He was breathing heavily, but the sheer terror I had heard earlier was slowly being replaced by a frantic, desperate energy. He thought he still had a viable exit strategy. He believed the hitmen would burn the cabin, eliminate the problem, and secure his $10 million insurance payout. But he was not planning to stick around to answer the questions of the local fire investigators. He was preparing to run. I listened closely as he activated the voice command system on his luxury dashboard. He ordered the automated assistant to connect him to a premium international airline concierge's desk. The line rang twice before a polite representative answered the call. Trent kept his voice steady, projecting the false calm of a wealthy businessman making a last-minute travel arrangement. He requested a first-class ticket on the next available direct flight out of Chicago O'Hare to Geneva, Switzerland. The representative confirmed a flight departing in 4 hours and asked for his payment information. Trent confidently recited the 16-digit number of his primary black credit card. I sat in the darkness of my cabin, staring out the front window, waiting for the digital guillotine to finally drop. There was a brief silence on the line as the representative processed the transaction. Then her polite voice returned, carrying a tone of mild professional confusion. She informed Trent that the transaction had been declined. Trent let out an annoyed sigh, completely oblivious to the reality of his situation. He blamed a banking error and confidently recited a second credit card number tied to a completely different offshore account. The representative typed the numbers into her system and waited. She returned a few seconds later, apologizing profusely, but stating that the second card had also been immediately rejected by the issuing bank. She asked if he had another method of payment. Trent's voice cracked slightly, the edges of his arrogance beginning to fray. He practically shouted a third card number into the dashboard microphone. The result was exactly the same. The representative told him that all his accounts appeared to be frozen and suggested he contact his financial institution. Trent abruptly ended the call, his breathing accelerating into short, frantic gasps. I heard him frantically tapping the screen of his phone, desperately trying to log into his mobile banking applications. He cursed violently, as every single application denied his access, locking him out of his own empire. He was officially a ghost, before he could fully process the absolute devastation of his financial ruin. His cell phone began to ring. It was a harsh, grating tone, echoing loudly inside the sealed cabin of his car. He answered the call, his voice barely a terrified whisper. The same thick, heavily accented voice of the cartel liaison spoke through the speakers. The man did not sound angry. He sounded chillingly calm. He told Trent that the leadership had just received a very interesting file containing the registration documents for a luxury yacht in the Bahamas. He informed Trent that they knew exactly where the $5 million had gone and that the 72-hour grace period was officially revoked. The liaison stated plainly that Trent was now a dead man walking and that the collection team was no longer coming for the money. They were coming for him. The line disconnected, leaving Trent completely trapped alone in a dark and suffocating silence. He gripped the leather steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white under the dim interior lights. He let out a primal, agonizing scream, hitting the dashboard repeatedly as he finally realized he had absolutely nowhere left on earth to run. Trent slumped back against the plush leather seat, his breathing ragged and uneven. The silence inside the luxury vehicle was heavy, suffocating him, as the reality of his absolute ruin settled over his mind. He was completely out of money. He was out of time, and the most dangerous cartel in the hemisphere was actively hunting him. Through the tactical headphones, I listened to his frantic gasps. I heard the unmistakable sound of him fumbling with his cell phone, his fingers slipping against the glass screen. He was dialing a number. The line began to ring, echoing loudly through the car's Bluetooth audio system. He was calling the 2 local enforcers he had just hired to burn down my cabin. He needed them to execute the job immediately, so he could somehow leverage the impending insurance payout to buy his life. The phone rang a second time, then a third. It rang until the automated voicemail picked up. Trent cursed violently, slamming his fist against the center console. He ended the call and dialed the second hitman. Again, the line rang endlessly, echoing into the void. He screamed at the dashboard, demanding that they pick up the phone. But nobody was ever going to answer those calls. What Trent did not know, what he could not possibly fathom as he sat panicking in his underground parking garage, was that his hired muscle had already been permanently neutralized. While Trent was busy crying to the cartel liaison and failing to buy a plane ticket, I had made a very brief, highly calculated phone call to a contact within the state police. I did not need to confront the hitmen myself. I had simply provided their exact vehicle description, license plate number, and current trajectory heading toward my rural property. Furthermore, I casually mentioned that the vehicle was currently transporting a significant quantity of illegal narcotics and unregistered firearms. The state troopers had intercepted their heavy SUV exactly 3 miles down the main highway. Right at this very moment, those two violent enforcers were lying face down on the wet asphalt, their hands securely zip-tied behind their backs, while federal dogs tore their vehicle apart. They were completely removed from the board. Trent was entirely alone. The audio feed picked up the sound of Trent hyperventilating. The walls of his meticulously constructed life had completely collapsed. His firm was frozen. His offshore accounts were gone. The cartel wanted his head on a spike, and now his only remaining asset, his hired assassins, had vanished without a trace. He was backed into the darkest, most desperate corner imaginable. I listened closely, knowing exactly how a cornered predator behaves. When they have no avenues of escape, they rely entirely on primal brute force. I heard the sharp metallic sound of the glove compartment being forced open. Papers rustled as Trent frantically dug through the tight space. Then came the distinct heavy clack of a slide being pulled back and released. He was loading a semi-automatic pistol. The sound sent a cold wave of absolute focus through my veins. He had completely abandoned the idea of a staged accidental fire. I was shifting to a direct violent assault. Trent began to mutter to himself, his voice trembling with a mixture of raw fear and murderous adrenaline. He was trying to rationalize his next moves, whispering his dark intentions aloud inside the empty car. I listened as he pieced together a desperate, horrifying escape plan. He reasoned that Emily still had access to her personal banking credentials and her emergency savings. It was not $7 million, but it was enough cash to buy a smuggled passport and secure passage across the northern border into Canada. He told himself over and over that he just needed to get to the cabin. He muttered that he would drag the security passwords out of her. He specifically used the word torture. He promised the empty air that he would break her fingers one by one until she transferred every single cent she possessed into an untraceable crypto wallet. He reasoned that the old tax accountant would be completely paralyzed by fear. He whispered that he would put a bullet in my head the second I opened the front door, and then he would take his time dealing with his wife. He planned to leave our bodies in the woods, steal my rusted pickup truck, to avoid being tracked by his own license plate, and vanish into the night. It was the frantic, unhinged fantasy of a man who had entirely lost his grip on reality. I sat motionless in my dark living room, absorbing the sheer depth of his depravity. He had started this morning pretending to be a grieving, devoted husband, seeking medical help for his troubled wife. Now he was openly planning to murder an elderly man and brutally torture the woman he had sworn to protect just to save his own miserable skin. The sheer entitlement, the absolute lack of any human empathy was staggering. He genuinely believed that our lives were completely disposable, simply tools for him to use and discard as he saw fit. Through the headphones, I heard the powerful engine of the Maserati roar back to life. Trent threw the transmission into gear, the tires squealing against the smooth concrete of the parking garage as he accelerated aggressively toward the exit ramp. The GPS tracking interface on my satellite phone immediately lit up. A small pulsing red dot appeared on the digital map, indicating his vehicle merging onto the rain-slicked interstate. He was heading straight for the rural highway. He was heading straight for me. I watched the red dot move steadily across the glowing digital screen, calculating his precise estimated time of arrival. The roads were dark and wet, meaning he would have to slow down once he reached the winding mountain paths. I had exactly 45 minutes before the monster arrived at my doorstep. I slowly removed the tactical headphones and placed them neatly on the wooden table. The cabin was profoundly quiet, the only sound being the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I reached over and picked up my 12-gauge pump-action shotgun. The heavy cold steel and polished wood felt perfectly balanced in my hands. I checked the safety, ensuring it was firmly engaged, and wiped a small speck of dust from the barrel. I had spent 4 decades bringing violent men to justice, dragging them out of the dark shadows and forcing them to answer for their crimes. I had faced cartel assassins, domestic terrorists, and ruthless syndicate enforcers. Trent Lawson was nothing but a desperate coward in an expensive suit. He thought he was driving into the deep woods to slaughter a weak, helpless old man. He had absolutely no idea that he was walking blindly into a federal trap. I stood up from my chair, my joints steady, my breathing calm, and walked toward the front door to prepare his final welcome to my home. I opened the heavy wooden front door and stepped out onto the damp planks of my front porch. The brutal thunderstorm that had battered the woods for hours had finally passed. It was exactly 10 o'clock at night. The sky was still thick with dark, rolling clouds, but the aggressive downpour had slowed to a complete stop, leaving behind a heavy freezing mist that clung tightly to the surrounding pine trees. The air smelled of wet soil, crushed leaves, and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone. I left the porch, light switched off completely, enveloping the front of the cabin in deep, impenetrable shadows. I walked over to the old wooden rocking chair, sitting in the corner, and lowered myself into it. The wood creaked slightly under my weight, a familiar, comforting sound in the overwhelming silence of the rural landscape. I rested the 12-gauge pump-action shotgun gently across my lap, keeping my right hand resting loosely near the trigger guard. In my left hand, I held a fresh mug of black coffee, the heat radiating through the thick ceramic and warming my stiff fingers. I took a slow sip of the bitter liquid, letting the heat anchor my focus. The woods were profoundly quiet now that the rain had ceased. There were no crickets chirping and no night birds calling out through the dark canopy. It was the kind of absolute heavy silence that usually precedes a violent storm. But tonight, it was the silence of a perfectly laid trap waiting to be sprung. I sat perfectly still, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness, until I could clearly see the muddy outline of the long gravel driveway leading up to my home. My breathing slowed to a steady, measured rhythm. I felt no fear. I felt no anxiety. The helpless state tax accountant had been entirely erased, leaving only the seasoned federal manhunter sitting in the dark. I thought about the man who was currently racing down the winding mountain roads toward my property. Trent Lawson believed he was a wolf descending upon a defenseless sheep. He was a man accustomed to using his massive wealth and corporate influence to crush anyone who stood in his way. But tonight, his wealth was completely gone. His offshore accounts were frozen. His credit was destroyed, and the violent cartel he had stolen from was actively hunting him down. He was completely stripped of his armor, acting on pure, desperate instinct. A desperate man is always the most dangerous opponent because he no longer cares about the consequences of his actions. Trent had convinced himself that torturing my daughter and murdering me was his only remaining path to survival. He had visualized this entire encounter in his mind, painting a picture of an easy slaughter. He expected to kick down my front door, find an elderly man cowering in the corner, and take whatever he wanted by sheer brute force. He had absolutely no idea that he was not driving toward a helpless victim. He did not know that the moment his luxury vehicle turned onto this rural road, he was stepping directly onto a federal staging ground. He was entirely blind to the invisible net that had already been pulled tight around his neck. I took another sip of my coffee and let the mug rest on the wide wooden armrest of my chair. The minutes stretched by, pulling the tension tighter with every passing second. I remained completely motionless, blending perfectly into the deep shadows of the porch. Then the profound silence of the isolated woods was finally broken. It started as a low, distant hum vibrating softly through the damp night air. The sound grew steadily louder, shifting from a faint mechanical drone to the distinct, aggressive roar of a powerful high-performance engine pushing far past its limits. I saw the sweeping beams of intense white headlights cut through the thick fog, illuminating the towering pine trees lining the edge of my property. The vehicle was moving entirely too fast for the treacherous, muddy conditions of the rural road. The headlights swung wildly as the car took the final sharp turn, forcing its way onto my property. The familiar crunch of heavy tires tearing through wet gravel echoed loudly across the open yard. The sleek silver Maserati skidded slightly as it entered the driveway, splashing thick, dark mud across its polished, expensive exterior. The sports car came to a sudden, violent halt right in front of my cabin, the headlights blindingly bright against the wooden steps of the porch. The engine cut off, but the headlights remained glaring into the night. For a brief moment, there was nothing but the sound of the hot engine ticking in the cold, damp air. Then, the heavy driver's side door was thrown open with aggressive, frantic energy. Trent stepped out into the mud. He no longer looked like the polished, arrogant venture capitalist who had visited my home earlier that morning. His expensive, tailored charcoal suit was disheveled and completely soaked from the lingering mist. His tie was ripped loose and his collar was unbuttoned, exposing his neck. I was breathing in heavy, ragged gasps, his chest heaving as he stood in the blinding glare of his own headlights. His eyes were wide, wild, and filled with the manic terror of a man who knew his entire world was collapsing around him. But the most important detail was not his ruined suit or his panicked expression. It was the heavy black semi-automatic pistol gripped tightly in his right hand. He raised the weapon, pointing it directly at the dark facade of my cabin. He did not bother to scan the perimeter or check his corners. He was entirely consumed by his own desperate need to survive. He marched forward, his expensive Italian leather shoes sinking deeply into the freezing mud with every aggressive step. He was moving with the frantic, unhinged energy of an animal backed into a corner, ready to destroy anything that stood between him and his escape. He closed the distance between his luxury car and the base of my wooden porch, believing with absolute certainty that he was about to command the room and take another life. He stood at the bottom of the steps, clutching his pistol, his chest rising and falling heavily. He stared into the pitch-black shadows of the porch, trying to pierce the darkness. He thought he was walking up to a slaughter. He was completely unaware that he had just stepped into the jaws of a trap that would swallow him whole. I watched him scan the dark windows of the cabin, searching for any sign of movement. His expensive shoes were now completely ruined by the thick, rural mud. He took a deep, shaky breath, preparing himself to commit cold-blooded murder. He truly believed he held the absolute ultimate power over life and death in this dark forest tonight. I remained seated quietly in the old rocking chair, listening closely to his heavy, erratic breathing. The freezing night air grew much colder around us. The final, unavoidable confrontation had arrived exactly on my terms. Trent raised the heavy black semi-automatic pistol and leveled it directly at the center of my chest. His hand was trembling slightly, but at this close range a stray bullet would still be absolutely lethal. He stood at the bottom of the wooden steps, his expensive shoes sinking deep into the freezing mud. He barked at me furiously, demanding to know exactly where his wife was hiding inside my home. He called me an old man and told me that if I handed the girl over, he might actually let me live. He tried to sound commanding, trying to project the image of a ruthless killer in control of the night. But I could hear the sharp, terrifying edge of pure desperation bleeding through his words. He was completely out of his depth. I did not flinch. I did not gasp or raise my hands in surrender. I sat perfectly still in the old rocking chair, letting the silence of the dark woods stretch out between us. I slowly brought the ceramic mug to my lips and took a long, deliberate sip of my black coffee. The heat grounded me, keeping my heart rate slow and steady. I lowered the mug and rested it back on the wide wooden armrest. I looked down at the pathetic, broken man standing in my driveway, and I let out a low, gravelly chuckle. The sound was deep and entirely devoid of fear. It echoed across the damp porch, cutting through the cold mist like a physical blow. Trent physically recoiled, his shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch as confusion washed over his face. He expected begging. He fully expected me to fall down to my knees in the dirt and desperately plead for my miserable life. My absolute calm terrified him far more than any weapon ever could. He tightened his grip on the pistol, taking a hesitant half-step forward on the bottom stair. He pointed his barrel aggressively toward my face, trying to reclaim the dominance that was rapidly slipping through his wet, trembling fingers. He demanded to know what I was laughing at, his voice cracking under the immense pressure. He loudly reminded me that he was holding a heavily loaded weapon and that I was completely alone out here in the absolute middle of nowhere. He swore he would pull the trigger if I did not tell him exactly where Emily was hiding. I looked at the gun, and then I looked directly into his wild, panicked eyes. Over my 40 years as a federal manhunter, I had stared down the barrels of countless firearms held by men infinitely more dangerous than the venture capitalist currently shivering on my lawn. I had faced hardened cartel sicarios who killed without a second thought, and domestic terrorists who believed deeply in their violent causes. Trent was nothing like them. He was a corporate predator, a coward who hid behind expensive suits and manipulated women because he lacked the fundamental spine to face a real opponent. He was holding a deadly gun in his hand, but he possessed absolutely no actual conviction. I did not move a single muscle in defense. I just sat there in the shadows, completely relaxed, allowing the overwhelming weight of my silence to break his fragile mind. I was rapidly drowning in his own adrenaline, his breathing loud and chaotic. I could see the exact moment the realization began to claw its way into his brain. The realization that I was not a terrified victim, and that this entire scenario was entirely wrong. I leaned forward slightly, the wood of the rocking chair groaning under the sudden shift in weight. I looked at him with an expression of pure, icy contempt. I simply told him that he talked entirely too much for a dead man. Trent blinked rapidly, the words hitting him with stunning force. He quickly demanded to know what I meant by that statement, his weapon wavering slightly as his confidence shattered completely. I kept my voice low, calm, and carrying the undeniable weight of absolute authority. I calmly told him that I already knew absolutely everything. I told him I knew about the $5 million he stole from the Valenzuela syndicate. I watched his face turn a sickening shade of pale white. I told him I knew about the luxury yacht he had quietly purchased in the Bahamas using their laundered drug money. He gasped, taking a clumsy step backward off the wooden stair, as if an invisible hand had struck his chest. I told him I knew about the $10 million life insurance policy he had recently taken out on my daughter, and exactly how he planned to pay off his cartel debt with her blood. His jaw trembled, his mouth opening and closing silently as he tried to form a coherent response. He looked around the dark, empty yard, paranoia finally consuming his rational thoughts. He asked me how I could possibly know any of those things. He accused me of bluffing, claiming I was just a senile old accountant making up crazy stories to buy time. But the pure, naked terror in his eyes told me he knew I was speaking the absolute truth. I was systematically dismantling his entire reality right in front of his eyes, without ever raising my voice or leaving my chair. I took another sip of my coffee, enjoying the bitter taste as it washed over my tongue. I told that his hired hitmen were not going to answer their phones tonight, or any other night, because they were currently sitting in the back of a state police cruiser miles away from here. I told him his offshore accounts were permanently frozen and his credit was entirely worthless. I told him that the cartel leadership had just received a very detailed anonymous package outlining his exact nautical purchases and that they were currently hunting him down. Trent lowered his weapon an inch, his arms shaking uncontrollably as his knees threatened to buckle. He was completely out of moves, out of money, and entirely out of time. He stared at me, realizing he was looking at the architect of his total destruction. He demanded to know who I really was, his voice a high-pitched, desperate whine. He said none of this made any sense, and that a retired tax accountant could not possibly do these things to him. I did not bother to answer his pathetic questions. The time for any further conversation between us was now officially over. I slowly reached my left hand deep into the warm side pocket of my thick flannel jacket. My fingers closed firmly around a small rectangular plastic remote control hidden inside the fabric. Trent saw the movement and instinctively raised his pistol again, shouting a frantic warning for me to keep my hands where he could see them. I looked him dead in the eyes without blinking, offering him a final truly chilling smile. I simply told him to look into the darkness and tell me what he saw. My thumb pressed down extremely hard on the small rubber button, sending the signal. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. The heavy darkness of the rural woods remained perfectly still. Trent kept his weapon leveled at my chest, his breathing jagged and loud. He opened his mouth to shout another desperate threat, to demand that I put my hands in the air and beg for mercy. The words never left his throat. The seconds stretched out agonizingly. He thought he was the ultimate authority in the world. He believed his money and his arrogance shielded him from any real consequences. He thought that the rural isolation of my property guaranteed his success. He was profoundly mistaken on every conceivable level. The trap was fully set, and it was time to close the jaws. The entire front yard erupted in a blinding explosion of artificial daylight. 4 massive military-grade tactical floodlights mounted high in the surrounding pine trees snapped on simultaneously. The sheer intensity of the illumination banished every single shadow from the property, turning the damp midnight air into a glowing white arena. Trent let out a sharp cry of physical pain. He stumbled backward off the bottom step of the porch, throwing his left arm over his face to shield his eyes from the agonizing glare. He waved his pistol blindly in the air, completely disoriented and entirely stripped of his tactical advantage. The sudden sensory overload shattered his aggressive posture. He spun around wildly, his expensive shoes slipping in the thick mud, desperately trying to comprehend the massive scale of the trap he had just walked into. The silence of the forest was instantly annihilated by the deep mechanical growl of heavy diesel engines roaring to life in the surrounding brush. From the dense tree line flanking the gravel driveway, 2 massive matte black armored tactical vehicles surged forward. They crashed through the low brush, their heavy reinforced tires churning the wet earth. They moved with terrifying coordinated precision, sliding into a perfect chevron formation, right behind Trent's silver luxury sports car. They completely blocked his only avenue of escape, trapping his vehicle against the edge of the dense forest. The heavy steel doors of the armored transports swung open in perfect unison. A dozen heavily armed federal agents poured out into the blinding light, moving with silent, lethal efficiency. They wore full tactical body armor with federal insignia blazoned across their chests and ballistic helmets masking their features. They did not shout warnings. They did not demand his surrender. They simply raised their suppressed rifles and took aim. Through the hazy mist created by the floodlights, dozens of bright red laser sights sliced through the damp air. They converged directly onto Trent's trembling body. I sat on the porch and watched as 5 separate red dots painted the center of his chest. Another 3 rested steadily on his forehead. Several more hovered over his knees and shoulders, marking every vital target point. He was entirely locked down, targeted by a highly trained tactical unit that would pull their triggers the instant he made a sudden, hostile movement. Trent froze, completely paralyzed by the overwhelming display of federal power. His weapon felt entirely useless in his hand, a child's toy compared to the heavy artillery currently aimed at his vital organs. His mouth opened and closed in silent horror, his arrogant facade crumbling into dust. From the impenetrable wall of tactical officers, a familiar figure slowly emerged into the bright light. It was Tom Barrett. He was not wearing a suit or sitting behind a computer screen. He was wearing a dark tactical jacket, his badge gleaming brightly against the ballistic nylon. He walked forward with the calm, measured stride of a man who had orchestrated thousands of these precise takedowns across the country. Tom stopped a few yards away from Trent, looking at the trembling venture capitalist with absolute disgust. He did not raise his voice. He simply told Trent to drop the firearm immediately, or he would personally authorize the tactical team to end the standoff permanently. The choice was violently simple. Trent looked at the red lasers dancing across his expensive, ruined suit. He looked at the heavily armed men surrounding him on all sides, blocking any hope of escape. The reality of his absolute ruin finally crushed the last remaining fragments of his enormous ego. His fingers went completely limp. The heavy black pistol slipped from his grip and fell into the thick, freezing mud with a dull, heavy thud. He raised both of his hands high into the air, falling heavily to his knees in the wet dirt. I was weeping openly, sobbing, with a miserable mixture of profound terror and absolute defeat. I pushed myself up from the old wooden rocking chair. The wood creaked loudly in the tense silence of the illuminated yard. I left my shotgun resting on the seat and walked slowly toward the edge of the porch. I did not shuffle my feet. I did not slump my shoulders. I stood tall, walking with the proud, rigid posture of a man who had spent 40 years bringing dangerous predators to justice. I walked down the wooden steps, the wet planks groaning under my heavy boots. I stopped right in front of Trent, towering over his kneeling, trembling frame. He looked up at me, his face pale and heavily streaked with tears and wet mud. The confusion in his eyes was absolute. He still could not reconcile the fragile old man he thought he knew with the commander of the tactical strike force currently surrounding him. I reached deep into the inside pocket of my flannel shirt, my fingers wrapped tightly around a heavy piece of solid metal. It was my old official badge. The tarnished silver star of a United States Marshal resting securely inside its worn leather casing. I pulled it out and tossed it casually onto the ground. It landed right next to Trent's ruined Italian leather shoes, the silver surface gleaming brightly under the intense tactical floodlights. Trent stared at the badge, his mind finally connecting the devastating pieces of his own destruction. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely no pity for the monster who had planned to burn my daughter alive for a payout. I told him he had made a fatal miscalculation when he decided to target my family. I asked him if he really thought I was just a harmless old tax accountant waiting to die. I let the question hang in the cold night air, letting the absolute truth sink deeply into his shattered mind. I told him that I did not file taxes. I told him I audited cartels. I told him that I had spent my entire life hunting down men far more dangerous and far more intelligent than a desperate corporate thief in a tailored suit. I told him that his banking accounts were officially closed, his criminal empire was entirely burned to ashes, and his cartel friends were eagerly waiting to have a very painful conversation with him. The federal manhunter had officially returned from the shadows, and his pathetic hunt was finally over. The words hung in the freezing night air, carrying the undeniable weight of absolute truth. I watched as the final pieces of Trent's carefully constructed reality shattered. He stared at the tarnished silver star resting in the mud next to his ruined shoes. His mind struggled violently to process the magnitude of his miscalculation. He had driven up this mountain expecting to find a frail retired accountant waiting to be slaughtered. Instead, he walked blindly into the iron grip of a United States Marshal who spent 4 decades dismantling operations vastly more sophisticated than his firm. The sheer arrogance that defined his entire existence evaporated. It was replaced instantly by a raw terror that drained all color from his face. He looked at me, his eyes wide and completely hollow. His jaw trembled uncontrollably. He tried to speak, to formulate some kind of desperate excuse, but his vocal cords failed him. The heavy black pistol suddenly seemed to burn his skin. His fingers uncurled and the weapon fell from his grip, landing in the wet gravel with a dull thud. His knees buckled, unable to support his weight. He collapsed sinkingly into the freezing mud of my driveway. He lowered his head and began to weep, the sound tearing through the silent woods. It was not the dignified silence of a defeated soldier. It was the loud, ugly sobbing of a coward who finally realized he possessed absolutely no power. Tom Barrett did not give the broken man any time to recover. He raised his hand, executing a sharp tactical gesture to the federal agents surrounding the perimeter. The tactical team moved forward, tightening the circle around the kneeling venture capitalist. Their boots crunched against the wet gravel, their suppressed rifles kept steadily trained on his chest. Two massive agents stepped directly behind Trent. One grabbed his expensive charcoal suit jacket, twisting the fabric firmly, and hauled him violently back to his feet. Trent let out a sharp cry of pain as his arms were wrenched forcefully behind his back. The cold click of heavy steel handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists echoed loudly across the yard. Tom stepped forward, his expression devoid of any sympathy. He looked at Trent with the clinical detachment of a man disposing of hazardous waste. Tom read him his rights, his voice cutting clearly through the misty air. He made sure Trent heard and understood every single word. Then Tom listed the federal charges. He informed Trent he was officially detained under suspicion of international money laundering, wire fraud, and active collusion with a narcotics syndicate. Trent weakly shook his head, trying to deny the accusations, but Tom was not finished. He stepped closer and added the final, most devastating charges. He told Trent he was charged with extensive insurance fraud and the premeditated conspiracy to commit the murder of his own wife. Trent let out a strangled gasp, pulling frantically against the steel restraints locking his arms. He began to beg wildly, shouting it was all a terrible misunderstanding. He swore he never intended to hurt Emily, claiming he was only trying to protect her from her severe mental instability. He looked frantically toward me, pleading for me to tell the agents he was a good husband who just made a few bad financial investments. He offered to give all the money back, promising to drain whatever remained in his personal accounts if we would just let him walk away. The sheer audacity of his bargaining was sickening. He believed he could buy his way out of a federal indictment. Before Tom could instruct the agents to silence the desperate man, an aggressive electronic ringing pierced the cold night. The sound was coming directly from the inner breast pocket of Trent's ruined suit jacket. It was not his primary smartphone. It was the distinct tone of a cheap, prepaid burner phone. The same encrypted device he used to communicate with the hitmen and the cartel liaison just an hour ago. The ringing did not stop. It was a relentless, demanding tune carrying a terrifying promise of extreme violence. The moment Trent registered the sound of that specific ringtone, the frantic begging died instantly in his throat. His entire body went rigid, his eyes widening in absolute horror. He knew exactly who was calling him at this late hour. The Valenzuela syndicate had reviewed the detailed financial ledgers we anonymously leaked to their main servers. They knew precisely where their missing $5 million had gone, and they were calling to collect their devastating pound of flesh. He stared at me, his chest heaving, his previous terror magnified into pure dread. The federal agents held him firmly in place, waiting for my final command. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between us until I was standing inches away from his trembling face. I looked down at him, ignoring the ringing phone in his pocket. I leaned in close, lowering my voice to a calm, chilling whisper that only he could hear over the idling engines of the armored vehicles. I told him federal prison was going to be a long, dark, and miserable experience for a man used to luxury. I paused, letting him feel the freezing mist against his skin. Then I told him maximum security isolation was the only place on earth where those men calling his pocket could not reach him tonight. I whispered that the federal government was the only thing preventing the cartel from skinning him alive before the sun came up. I looked deep into his terrified eyes and told him he should thank me for saving his miserable life. Trent squeezed his eyes shut, tears streaming down his face. He let out a loud sob, acknowledging the inescapable reality of his situation. I was no longer a powerful venture capitalist. He was a hunted animal, and the steel cage of a federal penitentiary was his only remaining sanctuary. He did not try to speak. He simply hung his head in absolute submission. I stood back and gave Tom a short affirmative nod. Tom immediately signaled the two tactical agents holding the prisoner. They turned Trent around, roughly marching him toward the heavy reinforced doors of the matte black armored transport vehicle waiting in the driveway. Trent stumbled over the wet gravel, his ruined shoes dragging through the mud. The agents shoved him firmly into the dark interior of the tactical van and slammed the heavy steel doors shut, locking them with a loud, definitive crash. The ringing burner phone was silenced, sealed securely inside the soundproof transport. Tom walked over to me, placing a firm, reassuring hand on my shoulder. He told me the perimeter was fully secure, and the cleanup crew would ensure the hitmen were processed quietly through the state troopers. I thanked my old friend for his flawless execution. The tactical floodlights began to shut down one by one, returning the rural property to the peaceful quiet of the midnight woods. The armored vehicles reversed slowly out of my driveway, their heavy tires crushing the wet gravel as they carried the monster away forever. I stood alone on the porch, taking a deep breath of the crisp, clean air. The violent storm had finally passed, and the hunt was definitively over. The tactical vehicles disappeared down the driveway, their red taillights bleeding into the thick fog. The intense floodlights that illuminated my yard powered down, returning the rural landscape to its peaceful darkness. I stood alone on the wet wooden porch, letting the cool night air wash over my tired face. The overwhelming adrenaline began to finally recede, leaving a profound, quiet clarity. The immediate threat was completely neutralized. Trent Lawson, the arrogant corporate predator who planned to murder my daughter for an insurance payout, was currently sitting in the back of a heavily armored federal transport van bound for a maximum security holding facility. He was stripped of his wealth, his power, and his freedom. I picked up the heavy 12-gauge pump-action shotgun I had left resting on the rocking chair. I engaged the safety and carried the weapon inside, securing it safely in the hidden vault beneath the stairs. The federal manhunter had finished his final assignment. It was time to go be a father again. I shifted my truck into gear and navigated the slick, muddy roads heading toward the dense mountain terrain where I had hidden Emily. The drive up the mountain was incredibly slow and deeply methodical. I took my time maneuvering the heavy truck up the treacherous rocky switchbacks and across the narrow wooden bridges. My mind rehearsed the conversation I was about to have. For 35 years, I had lied to my daughter. I had constructed a perfectly boring, meticulously ordinary life to shield her from the violent world I operated in every day. She grew up believing her father was a simple state tax accountant who spent his days reviewing tedious financial ledgers. She never knew about the cartel shootouts, the grueling manhunts, or the countless times I came home with bruises I blamed on clumsy accidents. I had protected her physically, but kept her entirely in the dark. Tonight, that wall of deception had to come down permanently. I reached the concealed garage of the federal safe house, pulling the truck inside and cutting the engine. I walked up to the heavy steel reinforced door and knocked, utilizing the specific rhythmic pattern I had told Emily to wait for. The thick door opened slowly, revealing my daughter, standing in the dim light of the backup generator. She was wrapped tightly in the woolen blanket, looking exhausted, but profoundly relieved to see my face. She took a step forward to hug me, but stopped abruptly. Her eyes fell to the center of my chest. In my haste to secure the perimeter, I had not bothered to remove my tactical gear. Underneath my open flannel jacket, I was wearing a heavy black ballistic vest adorned with empty ammunition pouches. My tarnished silver United States Marshal star was clipped prominently to the dark nylon webbing gleaming in the light. Emily stared at the ballistic vest and the silver badge, her brow furrowing in absolute confusion. She looked up at my face, scanning my calm, hardened expression. She asked why I was wearing body armor and where I had gotten a law enforcement badge. I stepped inside the safe house and closed the heavy steel door behind me, securing the locks. I gently guided her over to the small sitting area near the inactive concrete fireplace. I pulled up a sturdy wooden chair and sat directly across from her, resting my hands on my knees. I took a slow breath, steadying my own nerves. I looked deeply into her tired eyes, knowing that the next few sentences would completely rewrite her entire understanding of our family. I told her that I was so deeply sorry for keeping the truth from her for her entire life. I told her that her mother Martha was the only person who knew my real identity. I explained that I was never a state tax accountant. I told her that for 4 decades I worked as a senior investigator and tactical operator for the United States Marshal's Service. I explained that my primary job was hunting down the most dangerous fugitives on the planet, tracking assassins and dismantling organized crime syndicates. I told her my work made me very powerful enemies, men who would target a federal agent's family to seek brutal revenge. I explained the harmless accountant persona was a meticulously designed operational cover story. It was a shield created to ensure she and her mother could live completely normal, safe lives without constantly looking over their shoulders. Emily sat in stunned silence, absorbing the massive revelation. She looked at the silver star on my chest and then back up at my weathered face. She asked me what had happened to Trent. I reached out and took both of her cold hands in mine, holding them firmly to transfer my strength. I told her she never had to worry about that man ever again. The absolute sheer terror that had haunted her for so long was finally coming to a definitive end. I explained the entire sequence of events that had transpired over the past few hours. I told her how Tom and I utilized federal wiretaps and clearance codes to completely freeze every single one of Trent's bank accounts. I explained how we intercepted the hitmen he hired to burn us alive and anonymously leaked his massive financial theft to the cartel leadership. I assured her that Trent was currently in federal custody, facing decades behind bars for money laundering and conspiracy to commit murder. I watched a profound physical transformation take place in my daughter. The heavy, suffocating weight of fear that had pulled her shoulders down for months began to lift. She realized in that quiet moment that she was never truly crazy. She had simply been systematically manipulated by a wealthy sociopath who used psychological warfare to isolate and control her. Trent tried to convince her she was entirely powerless and completely alone in the world, but he had fundamentally failed to understand that she was the daughter of a man who hunted monsters for a living. I told Emily that Trent would spend the rest of his miserable life locked inside a tiny concrete maximum security cell, terrified the cartel would find a way to reach him. His vast fortune was gone, and his arrogant power was entirely broken. He was nothing but a terrified prisoner now. A small, genuine smile finally broke across Emily's face. It was a smile born of true, absolute safety. We sat together in the quiet safe house, talking for hours, as I shared stories from my past, the real stories I kept locked away for decades. As the early morning light began to filter through the small reinforced windows, we walked outside together. We stood side by side on the mountain ridge, watching the bright golden sunrise illuminate the vast, sprawling valley below us. The freezing rain was gone, replaced by the warm, promising light of a brand new day. I put my arm around my daughter's shoulders, pulling her close. We were a father and a daughter standing together, with absolutely no more secrets between us, finally at peace and ready to begin again, forever. Arrogance is a truly powerful and blinding disease. Predators like Trent prey on empathy, mistaking kindness for weakness and age for helplessness. They believe their expensive suits and loud threats grant them power over those who choose to live quietly. But true strength does not need to announce itself. It sits patiently in the dark, watching, waiting, and protecting its own. Never underestimate the lengths a father will go to shield his child, and never assume that a quiet life means a defenseless one. Sometimes the most dangerous man in the room is the one sipping coffee on the porch. Have you ever seen an arrogant bully get exactly what they deserve? Tell me your story in the comments below. If you loved this satisfying payoff, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss another tale of justice served cold. Stay safe out there today, friend.